going to transition now directly into the panel on equity. And again, you've got another handout on your table that is key questions to consider that we released about 2 months ago. And I'd urge you to look at it because there's no solution here. But these are questions from early learning to K-12 to post-secondary that state policymakers should be considering when they're tackling some of the equity issues. And it's not just with ESSA, it's with a host of the other issues that you have where this question is coming up. I'm really excited to introduce our next three panelists who are going to be moderated by Sue, and we have another star-studded group. I'm excited to have Margie Van Dieven, who is the Commissioner of Education for the great state of Missouri, and this morning was elected the next treasurer for the Education Commission of the States with us. So. It's great to have Teresa Lubers here, who has a varied history in public service. She is currently the commissioner of the Indiana Commission of Higher Education and has been there for 8 years. In a previous life, for 17 years, she was a state senator who was tackling many of these same issues in multiple different ways. And we're excited to be joined also by Stephanie Wood Garnett, who has really done a lot of work through the Alliance for Excellent Education. She serves as their Vice President of Policy to Practice. But a lot of her focus over the years has been on really systemic change at both the local, state, and federal levels. And that's not easy because we can all have good ideas, but finding that systemic change is what's really difficult. So join me in welcoming this panel to discuss achievement gap issues and where equity fits in America.
Good morning. We only met by phone before, so I'm happy to see this fantastic panel in person. I'm going to kick off by asking each of the three of you a similar question and ask you to come at it in your own way. Which achievement gap are you most focused on closing? What's persistently hard, and where are you seeing progress? And I'll let you start, Stephanie.
Good morning, thank you. For the Alliance for Excellent Education, our focus is really on high schools. And as I look out at this group, I know that many of you have a focus across the K-20 or P-20 system. But if we think about what's happening in high schools around this country, there's so much opportunity that we have available, but that equity gap continues to exist for too many students. So if we think about all of the reports that have come out recently about the resegregation of schools, if we think about the number of young people who leave school without a diploma, or the fact that we have over 2,400 high schools in the US that graduate fewer than 67% of their students, we really have some opportunities to rethink what high school experiences can look like and how to make that equitable is the important part of the conversation today. Equity will mean that not only are the pathways available in every high school, but the supports might need to be weighted for certain students to really take advantage of those opportunities. We may need to give more to young people who are poor, who might be disabled, who might be from different language learning groups, who are facing different challenges in their life. And I think that's something for us to really think about differently.
Great, thank you. Teresa, how do you think about the achievement gap, and what's hard and what are you excited about?
Well, I thank you for your morning comments as well before. As you look at this whole issue of equity, I think we have this clash a little bit between this permeating American philosophy of opportunity for all that really clashes with the historical reality that we haven't had opportunity for all. And what does that mean and why it is important? So you have this very important discussion that we need to have about how do you make sure that everybody has an opportunity to live a meaningful life. In a more pragmatic way, from what I do on a daily basis, is we're looking at increasing the education attainment of Americans, of Hoosiers in the case of Indiana, knowing that we have a long way to go and that there is no way to get to any of those attainment goals that we've established by state. Indiana set a 60% goal. No way to get there without doing a better job to close the achievement gap. For us, the achievement gap is, yes, we need to remain very vigilant about making sure that there is access to all, but for us, it is really about closing this completion gap. That is getting students who have the aspiration and the preparation to move into higher education, making sure that they have a chance to complete that. And we know that we're making progress, but the gaps are significant still. We established a resolution in Indiana in 2013 that said we would close the achievement gap by 2025 and cut it in half by 2018. a very, very ambitious goal. We're moving in the right direction, but we're not on track to close it.
Great, great.
Thank you. Yes, in Missouri, we are focused on all students, as you've heard from all of the chiefs that you've heard from. We keep talking about if all means all, what will that take? And when we look at our data very closely, we are seeing that we are moving the needle at our historically low-performing subgroups, but our higher level has been a bit stagnant. So what we're really trying to figure out is how do we establish policy that really forces very intentional look at every single child in our system. And so a couple of things that I'll get to in just a moment. What do we find hard about that? While we're putting pressure on the classrooms and putting pressure on increasing rigor and putting pressure on offering opportunities, we're also seeing an increase in social and emotional needs. We're also hearing, every time I meet with teachers, I'm asking, what do you need? And they say access to mental health services and those types of other issues that continue to seem to escalate. And so it's this multifaceted issue that we're looking at. And then where do I see some of the successes that we're making in that issue? We spent a lot of focus over the last several years on really helping to prepare and support our teachers. Do our children in the state of Missouri have equitable access to great teachers in every single classroom? I will have to tell you no. And that is a challenge for us simply because there's a number of issues. We have districts in very, very remote rural Missouri with 23 students. And we have districts in urban areas, and we have very wealthy suburban districts. And the equitable distribution of funds for paying our teachers is not the same. And so we know in Missouri that a great teacher can make a great difference for kids. We know that access to things like internet services need to be provided for every single school, so we're working on interventions there. But it's really just the great diversity of our state right now, focusing on all means all, and looking at every policy. I'll just give you a really quick example here. Changing an attendance policy, we've talked about chronic absenteeism, from looking at every child, so saying that we want to make sure kids are in school at least 90% of the time, not an aggregate. I've gotten so many calls from different schools and superintendents that say, it is really hard for us to meet that mark at the high school. So then you can stop and say, that's 17.4 days in Missouri that we're having a hard time meeting that mark. Let's talk about the data. What's the issue? And then when they back out and say, okay, the issue is I've discovered that most of my students are working late at night and they're tired and they're sleeping in, that's an issue to resolve. Those are solvable things, but it's using data established by policy. Some of them are, taking care of younger siblings. Using data, identifying what the issues are, and providing the supports so that every child has access.
That's a great example. Margie, let me just start with you on this part. So each of you talked about achievement gaps and all means all. I like that. But come back from where you sit in Missouri. When you talk to folks around your state, how would they define equity? What does equity mean if you're in Missouri?
Well, I think like Jeremy, oftentimes you bring up equity and it talks like a foundation formula. Are they receiving equitable funding? That's what you might hear. What we're continuously talking about, does every child have access to the same resources that they need to be successful? And this conversation's been going on for a long time. I remember teaching 20 years ago and having a mentor say to me, it's as simple as a Band-Aid. If Johnny needs a Band-Aid, you give Johnny a Band-Aid. You don't give the entire class a Band-Aid because Johnny needs a Band-Aid. It's really helping us identify to us looking at the individual child, what are the needs, and then making sure that those resources are accessible to that child.
Teresa, how do you think about that question? And how has that discussion on equity evolved during the incredible variety of experiences you've had as a leader?
I think in Indiana, I agree with you. We've had complexity index, and we have all kinds of ways that we fund schools that acknowledge the fact that we have some students who come to school with different learning styles and challenges. And so we've talked about that with funding. But I think at this point, what we're talking about a lot more is what you referenced, which is really the achievement gap. I mean, the goal is to make sure that people have the opportunity to live meaningful lives. And this doesn't stop with quality preschool, as important as that is, or making sure that more people graduate from high school, as important as that is. It is about a lifetime that will be benefiting from the education. And so We have, for example, we've put in place in our completion reports, we do college readiness reports, completion reports, return on investment reports, a value index, and in our completion reports, we disaggregate everything in all of our reports by race, gender, ethnicity, and that really drives policies. But in our college completion report, we've included an achievement gap measure where campus by campus, we look to see how close they are to closing the completion achievement gap. And we share that information. We have a few campuses that are actually on target to close it by 2025. All of them are moving in the right direction, but that's the kind of data that they need to have, because otherwise, you know, those numbers, we hide behind, we don't really know those numbers sometimes. And so we know anecdotally, we know, but we need to know in a very specific way how well we're doing campus by campus in closing that. So for us, it is really about the achievement gap, both that exists in early childhood education all the way through.
Got it. And Stephanie, you said something in your opening comments about resegregation of high school. Talk about equity in high school and what equity means to you, given where you sit.
Sure. So I will actually say, as an organization, we've been on a journey this year to deepen our understanding about equity. Because we, each person in this room, we bring a personal experience and perspective about what equity is. And when you put us in an organization, we can't assume that we each have the same vision or the same understanding of what that means. So we organizationally have spent time this year digging deeply into what does equity mean, what does diversity mean, what does inclusion mean. And one thing that we know is that you can't have equity without inclusion, and that even though we are all incredibly dedicated to this work, some of the stories I heard this morning about the number of engagement meetings, the number of times that you're sitting with civil rights groups, that's really going to get us to equity. So I would say, from a definition perspective, that within high schools, if you were to think of a school district and you were to visit a high school in a high income zip code versus a high school in a lower income zip code, what would you see that might differ between those two environments? Are there different teachers? Are there more national board certified teachers in one building? Are there more advanced courses in one building? Are there different levels of counselors between those buildings? Are there more SROs or school resource officers assigned to a specific building? I think when we think about equity in high schools, we really need to be thinking about the school culture and climate. We need to be thinking about the level and types of instruction available to young people, because it is not the same across zip code and across different groups. And we also need to be thinking about the ways in which those young people are getting messages about how we value them. How we value them is in terms of what their facility may look like. How we value them is evident in the types of internships, apprenticeships, career-based conversations we're having with them. How we value them is acknowledged by the types of mentors we bring into schools. I have worked in districts where mentors for high affluent students were doctors and lawyers, but mentors in low-income communities at times were people who had learned from mistakes. And we all make mistakes, but let's give equal access to the types of mentors and the opportunities to each of our students in an equitable fashion. I think we can do this, but I really do think we need to look deeply at what is currently happening in high schools across our country and have honest conversations about whether or not the young people in those buildings believe we believe they can. And we know that engagement is a main factor here that we're struggling with. The Gallup 2016 data shows that young people are saying 50% or greater are saying, I'm completely disengaged or I'm not engaged. And the engagement levels are dropping from 5th grade through high school. So what is it that we're doing in high schools? How are we using those one-to-one devices or different technological advances to inspire learning and to help young people connect to the world? I think we have lots of equity opportunities, but I do hope that we can continue to work together to deepen the conversation and also the approaches.
That's great. So I want to pick up on something you just said about connecting and engagement. I talked before about how much I've learned about place and the importance of place and community. So Teresa, let me start with you. Traditionally, when we talk about outreach or community involvement, we're talking about parents, families, How do you extend the reach to community? How do you get, for example, jobs is such a big issue, career is such a big issue wherever I go and talk within schools or families. How do you, in Indiana, connect community, including the people who've got jobs, business leaders, others in the community who might not be talking about a lesson, but might be talking about the great jobs of the future and how those students might connect and be inspired by those?
We're all in this together, and to think that educators or parents, as important as those two may be, and one could argue that those are the two most important, that we still have to extend this discussion and the support system far beyond that. I think one of the most encouraging things I've seen in the nearly 25 years that I've been doing this work between the Senate and at the Commission would be the full engagement at a much higher level of employers and community leaders, with an understanding that it is critically important to their communities that there not be groups of people left behind and that they can't succeed as a community. So we are seeing employers in a very robust way engage in career exploration, mentoring through all kinds of programs in the state, doing tuition reimbursement, actually some cases forgoing tuition. This is especially important for adult students who return to complete their credentials. And so I think you are seeing that. We have college success and summits in most of our counties around the state. So I think what we all understand is that if we don't do this better than we've been doing this, that we don't have an opportunity to provide the kind of meaningful life to individuals or the kind of employees that our employers need. We hear this all the time, this mismatch between what employers say they need and the skill sets that people have. So knowing that students are exiting high school, college or career ready in the ways that we define that, and that we're bringing back people as well. We're running a couple really exciting programs in Indiana now, focused on what I know you are as well. And I have to put a plug in for the adults as well in this case. We have 750,000 people in Indiana who have some college but no degree. That's 21% of our working age population. And so we're providing incentives, and communities and employers are working with us to get them to come back. We just started with the help of legislators, many in the room today. It's called a Workforce Ready Grant, where we're saying if you come back in a high demand area, the tuition will be free because you're making a commitment to something the state needs. So I guess what I really see happening is one of the most important developments is this convergence between educators and policymakers and employers to lead with an agenda that will strengthen education in the states.
That's great. Margie, can I ask about Missouri and maybe just push you a little bit on how do you think about this connection to community, but how do you think about equity when you do connect, whether it be a place of work or religious groups or community leaders that may be outside of that traditional educators and parents?
So we debate this quite a bit in Missouri. So goes the community, so goes the school, or so goes the school, so goes the community, right? And so it's a very, we have state law that allows the State Department to intervene in schools that are struggling, and we have done that, and I'll just tell you a real quick story on this. We intervened in an unaccredited school district, and by state law, we need to conduct public hearings in these school districts. And I was brand new to the role as commissioner, and I walked into this room, and there was a mic, and the community was there to speak to us. And there was a lot of anger in the room. There was a lot of heavy emotion in the room. If you can think about what was happening in St. Louis roughly 3 years ago, you're probably very familiar with some of the circumstances there. We walked out of that, and I said, that can't happen again. That wasn't productive. It wasn't what we were trying to do in engaging the community. The community resource in the district said, I will help you, and they brought me and a number of our board members and some other staff to sit down in private rooms and talk with people, just talk, because there was such a tremendous disconnect. I wanted to help provide their kids with better opportunities because those kids deserved it. Those kids were not getting an education that they absolutely deserved, and yet the community felt attacked, like we were going to close their school and ruin their community. So how do you get to this issue? We met in a number of those one-on-one conversations. The next public hearing we held, we had round tables like you have here, And we had dialogue, and we said, let's solve these issues. What does the community want for the school? How can we support you, as Tony said, not a top down, but how can we support you in providing better opportunities for your children in this school district so that they are prepared to be successful? Change the conversation. The last meeting we went to, the culinary arts students were serving food and they were playing music as you walked in, and we were there to greet the community. We are in this together, and it's very important. So the chaplains were there, and many people, when they speak on Sunday and they say education is a priority for your kids, you have the responsibility as a parent and as a community member to educate in school and outside of school. It is our job to raise our children. And so I think they are a very powerful commitment to this group as well. And then the workforce, you know, quite frankly, so many of our businesses are tired of just throwing money at solutions. They want to be partners, and we're seeing great things happening where we're engaging in apprenticeships and externships and internships and things that are happening where and they're saying it's good for their workforce too, because they're reinvigorated by helping high school students get excited about their profession. So I think there's great opportunity here. It absolutely takes the entire community because it's about our children.
Yeah, Stephanie?
I wanted to add to that, this idea of the economic imperative as a way to engage in conversations is something that we definitely are finding important in the work that we're doing at the Alliance for Excellent Education. One of the things that we began about 2008 was developing an economic model to suggest what would happen if you can increase former dropouts into graduates with regards to your economy. Not only the national economy, but your state, the state of Missouri, the cities, the major cities. And we've been really incredibly pleased with the support from business and from higher education and from K-12 as well as communities around this is a way for us to bring people in the room. I love what you just talked about in terms of having the round tables. Around the country, we have people sitting around round tables looking at what could happen if we could increase graduation rates. We can't leave young people behind from any of our populations, and this is about our community and our kids. And I think this economic narrative is something that we each should be thinking about as a way to get people excited about equity, because economic imperative and economic opportunity is something that everyone wants. And we can figure out how to do this together if we could at least have a common language.
No, I'm really struck by what all three of you have said about moving from rule following to opportunity. It sounds like it's a theme going on. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists about achievement gap, but I'm going to warn the audience that you will have a chance to ask this great panel question. So start thinking about your questions. But before I call on the audience, I'd love to hear a few stories from you guys. Like, tell me about a story of closing the achievement gap. You know, we're looking for some inspiration. What does success look like in closing the achievement gap? And what stories can you share with the audience to give us hope and optimism that in fact it can be done, and the kinds of things that you've seen work on closing the achievement gap? And Stephanie, why don't you start?
Sure. So I'm currently at a national nonprofit, but I have worked at the SEA and in several school districts. So there are a couple things, or two things I would say specifically. First, closing the achievement gap is incredibly difficult and challenging, and I do admire the leadership that it takes to get it done. Leaders in those situations often feel like there's almost a target aimed at them, because they're having to think about how do we make opportunities improve for certain groups of students while at the same time not alienating other students and families in our community. So one example I will share is in working with Title I programs in a school district, and really trying to think about how do we rethink both how we allocate the resources coming to our district, as well as how do we rethink the ways in which we're supporting teachers in those classrooms. What kinds of professional learning experiences do they want? What do they want to know more about in terms of the students who are now part of our school district, because our demographics were changing? The other thing our leaders wanted to know is, I don't know how to lead for equity. That was not part of my program to become a principal. There was no class that I took or a set of experiences. So I will say that we saw an incredible change in leadership interest and leadership capacity around using different teacher evaluation observation rubrics to support classroom instruction. Did we completely close the gap? No, but we began to see some gains in terms of what young people were able to learn and what they were able to do. But most importantly, it helped the educators in our system not feel always, I want to say, I will use the word demoralized right now, because sometimes when you're in a low performing district or school, people assume that you're not performing at a high level as an educator, and I think that is a mistake. And I think that the support we provided our educators was important for morale, and it helped them feel that they could actually make changes in their practice to help young people. And we saw young people entering our elementary to middle to high school transitions with greater demonstration of knowledge on our assessments, both our formative as well as our summative. So I think it can be done, but I want to keep saying we have to support the educators in doing that.
Margie, you're nodding your head, and let me just, I think what was so striking about that story is that sense of pessimism and failure. You know, there is some baggage here when we talk about the achievement gaps and lots of stories of failure. How have you thought about overcoming that and getting the sense of optimism that Stephanie's talking about?
Well, I was
what do you
nodding
say?
a lot because I did make the comment earlier that one of our concerns is making sure we have great teachers in our schools that really need the assistance the most. And it's not that we don't have really good teachers there, it's that it is a tougher job. There's just no doubt about it. It is a tougher job. And they often get recruited to the wealthy suburban districts and get paid more for it. It's still a hard job. Teaching is a hard job. No, but that just seems backwards to me. So that's what I was. It's not that they're not great teachers. It's just that they get recruited quite frequently once they're in these schools. So that is an area that I'm noting. A couple of areas of success that I think we've seen. We can never underestimate our human capital. And in St. Louis right now, we have some exciting things that are happening, I believe. St. Louis Public Schools has just been regained full accreditation. They have had the same superintendent for 9.5 years, and they have a special administrative board through state law. One is appointed by the governor, one by the mayor, and one by the Board of Aldermen. We also have a Riverview Garden School District that we have intervened in, and they've gained provisional. They have a different law, a different board. They're appointed three special administrative boards members appointed by the State Board of Education. The third one that I'm talking about is Normandy, that we've tried something different there on a different law, joint executive governing board, where we've taken 2 of their elected board members and 3 that we've appointed from the State Board of Education. And then a 4th district is Jennings, which has your typical locally elected board, and they're functioning. So I think I called each of those superintendents in preparation for this meeting. I said, what does it really take? And they said, we can never underestimate strong local governance that pushes for excellence. You've got to constantly be setting the high expectations that all of these children will succeed. So we see that. Then you go to the rural pockets of our state, and they have very different needs. There it's more, we have a map that we've developed on how do you find where our teacher shortage is, and it is very much around geography. And so what we're trying to do there is make sure every single school has internet access. I'm sure to some of you that sounds absurd still, but we are making sure that every single school has access to high-functioning internet services. Not just, I think I heard the comment yesterday, it's not just about online access, but we have to figure out how to share our resources. We have 518 school districts, 38 charter LEAs. If you have an AP physics teacher that's knocking the charts off, we've got to figure out how to share that resource through online services and do some cross-district work there. They're all of our students, and we have to recognize that. And then if you'll bear with me, one more final thing. We've been seeing a lot of progress in like the Waynesville School District. They've been working with the National Math and Science Initiative, where the teachers are equipped with the skills that they need. They go through rigorous training on this, and then the students are exposed to rigorous content, and seen a tremendous increase in our AP scores, specifically in our African American and Hispanic children, and I think that is very exciting for our state to see that work. But it's pockets still, so we're working on how do we make that scalable across the state.
That's great. How's this work in Indiana? Have you figured out the secret sauce on achievement gap, Teresa?
Well, this is such a multi-layered discussion, and I think one of the things that I would like to point out that I think has worked well in Indiana, which is that we are a very generous state when it comes to the distribution of need-based financial aid. We actually rank first in the Midwest and fifth in the nation. We have several very important programs. One is called our 21st Century Scholars Program. It's been around for 27 years. In good times and bad, the legislature has continued to fund this program. It's our promise that we make to low-income, first-generation, many minority students that if you work hard when you're in school, we'll make sure you can afford to go to college. And we've had more than 110,000 students who have accessed higher education through this program. One of the things that we discovered was, yes, we knew that students needed to be financially able to access higher education, and we knew they needed to be academically prepared. What we didn't think about were all of the other ways in which when they landed on a college campus, they still might not persist. And so what we've realized is that for our scholars, they can't be anonymous when they arrive on a college campus. We have to find all learning communities, checking in on them quickly, having older scholars work with younger scholars, all the reasons why you've probably been reading the stories, and our friends here from Tennessee who are looking at all the models for free community college in Tennessee, and the reasons why even when there is a financial commitment, we may not have people either access or succeed. And this is especially true and important when it comes to closing the achievement gap, and most of our scholars are students who it will be necessary for us to reach them to close that gap. So I think thinking about preparation and both academic and financial is important. We've put in place, for example, a Scholar Success Program where for our scholars who sign up in 7th and 8th grade and then have certain activities that they have to participate in. There was some criticism when we did that, thinking that we might be asking them to do things that would drive people out. My contention was that if we put in place the right expectations, it will make them more likely to succeed. And we are seeing the highest affirmations and the highest success for our scholars since we've actually turned the program into more of an earned benefit program with expectations tied to success.
That's great. That's a great story. It's something that both of you said so resonates for me from my experience at University of California, San Francisco. If you're first in your family to go to nursing school, first in your family to go to medical school, you can have all the support in the world, but if you were that responsible person in the family, and your family's in Fresno or the Central Valley, the first weekend they may call you up and expect you to still be that responsible person. It's like you were saying, Margie, about childcare at night. So I think sometimes we underestimate how that first in the family student still has pressure at home, no matter how much they've achieved for themselves. Those are really powerful stories. Thank you. So as you can all hear, these three are awesome. So questions for the panel from the audience? There's a question there. The mic is running.
Good morning. My name is Joni Smith. I'm the Louisiana State Teacher of the Year. Good morning, beautiful people. Abdul, that's for you. I just want to address something that I haven't heard yet, and it's kind of somewhat of a hardball question. So we've mentioned equity gaps for students, and my state has made great strides just like many others. However, I'm not seeing equity being addressed for teachers. And what I mean by that is, for example, many states do not welcome teachers at the ed policy conversation. So if you're not welcome at that table, how are you getting a direct reflection of student performance, if you will? So when you think about the gaps that exist, teachers have a direct connection with our kids, but yet our voices aren't heard at ed policy conversation tables. So I want to ask you, as state leaders, do you feel that your respective states and other states are doing a good job at welcoming teacher voices when ed policy is on the table?
I suppose we could all do better, and that probably goes without saying. I would say that I think what we understand when you talk about issues of reform in education or policy changes, these are only sustainable if there is buy-in from the people who are in the classroom who are actually making those policies come to life, whether it's in K-12 or whether it's in higher education. So not to have them engaged up front with buy-in for whatever the policy might be and the intended consequences for that, probably doom that to a short-term policy, not a sustainable policy in terms of implementation and sustainability. So I'm sorry to hear that that is the case. I'm reminded of how intentionally we need to think about that in new ways. We work very closely aligning everything from early childhood education to K-12 to higher ed to workforce development to economic development, and we really need to have the voices all along the way.
And I'll take that too. We are, again, we can always do better, but I heard that question raised a couple of years ago, I believe. It may have been here. And I went back and I said, I really do need a teacher advisory council. I have a superintendent advisory council. We've had one, but we've implemented the teacher advisory council, and it is incredibly helpful. So I directly meet with them as the commissioner and say, we're thinking about this policy. How will that play out? And get really powerful feedback. One of the things that we have to work through is that teachers don't like to be out of their classrooms, right? And so it's hard to figure out when it's appropriate to call teachers in and when is it appropriate. It's just a trickier business. And so when we're having meetings, we make sure that we hold them after school hours, our regional meetings. We said we need to make sure the teachers are there. We've extended, we have advisory committee meetings that meet without me that do include, make sure that there are teachers on them, or teacher representatives. But it has to be, as you said, very deliberate and thoughtful, because if you hold every meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning, the likelihood that teachers are going to be able to be there is slim. So we're working on that.
Yeah. Stephanie?
I'll just add, when I worked for a State Department of Education in New York, we had a teacher advisory council. We also had teachers represented on our professional standards and practices board. We were very involved with our teacher centers, which is teachers for teachers-led professional development. So I think what you're saying is critically important, that teachers need to be at that table and providing support and feedback and ideas. But I also think we need to start it earlier. So one of the things that I was doing was trying to work with our teacher education programs and to visit classrooms in which future teachers are taking classes to talk to them about, let me tell you what's happening with our work on the Common Core. Here's what we're struggling with regards to how we think about assessment. What do you think? So I think there's opportunities to begin thinking about the pipeline of our teachers and really begin the conversations early so that teachers are aware of what the opportunities are to be involved once they're in the classroom as well.
That's great. Yes. I think there's a question behind you, and then the mic will come forward.
Thank you. State Representative Bob Benning from Indiana. In regards to, I'll respond a little bit to the question from the Teacher of the Year. One group that I will give a shout out to as a policymaker that I have turned to a lot is called Teach Plus. Teach Plus has 26,000 members across the country. Teach Plus are educators who are really interested a lot in policy. I spent Friday evening at a Teach Plus conference where they were doing a briefing on different policies that they had looked at. One of them was assessments, and in Indiana we just had an assessment bill that I authored, and we had 12 Teach Plus teachers come to the ceremonial signing of an assessment bill, which is not something you would typically find. But these teachers were really enthused that they had been involved. They came and testified at committee on both House and Senate side. They were involved in the whole assessment design. So I think there's opportunities out there. There's a number of groups. Like I said, I'll give a shout out to Teach Plus. My question is more specific in terms of teaching, closing the achievement gap, and specifically with having the Teachers of the Year here. Teachers are have a significant impact in terms of closing that gap. And it appears to me that we're doing a very poor job as a country in terms of dealing, especially in our urban schools, with the teacher turnover. NCES reports 17% of all teachers leave within the first 5 years of teaching. If you look at your urban schools, which is where we have the highest level of poverty, you have the most teachers with the least amount of seniority. And District of Columbia schools reported last year, past school year, in one high school alone, 25% of their teachers left before the end of the school year. If you can't get that kind of consistency and quality, what are we going to do? And NCSL did a study of international education, and we went to Shanghai, China. And China has put together career ladders in their system where the teachers to move up in a career go to schools that are low performing to move up. And in our country, unfortunately, higher performing or more affluent communities get the best educators. What are we doing to focus more of our get more of our better teachers and teachers with longevity in our urban school districts where we need it most to close the achievement gap.
So how do you think about teacher turnover and
Yeah,
getting
I
the
mean,
teachers in the right
that
place?
was really, that's really one of the points I was trying to make earlier. I think that is a great concern for us. Some of the things that we're doing, we turn straight to our educator preparation programs and are making sure that we are including those components in our educator preparation so that, most teachers don't leave because they don't like the job. A lot of them feel ill-equipped to walk into what they're walking into. And so it's making sure that they're prepared. But we have, the retention is a great concern in our state across the board. And so by providing mentors, by providing, as I mentioned earlier, trying to connect better with mental health services and the Department of Social Services and making sure that schools have the outside resources that they need so teachers can teach in their classrooms is another area that we are considering. But I think it's going to take quite a big shift to really make the transformation that you're talking about there, where we start to really value and emphasize and understand that children who are in struggling schools often don't get to go home to the school the parents that you were talking about reading books to them because they're working or elsewhere. And so they need the absolute best teachers, and that's going to take a shift in thinking across the entire nation.
I think it also may be changing the narrative around teaching a little more here. So there are a couple of things that I've noticed in working in a state education department where we did have shortage issues in our urban schools. The first is that there are systems that we have in place that contribute to that inequitable situation. So if we look at how we handle teacher recruitment, who gets it done first, who's out really actively seeking teachers from certain colleges. Do certain colleges of teacher ed have relationships that are longstanding with certain districts, and then it's harder for an urban district to attract that teacher? What are the incentives for teachers who wish to work in urban school districts? Are we offering loan forgiveness? Are we helping them find housing? What are the conditions they're walking into? Have we really made those equitable investments to ensure that all of our schools are safe, the facilities are the facilities that we would want our children in, that we have opportunities for young people to feel that they are loved and valued in that environment? School culture matters. And I think we also have to think about our pipelines. The more that we can do to re-attract and re-energize young people in the classroom, the better our pipeline will be. As a mother of 4 teenagers and a person who hangs out in high schools, I would say that they don't want to be teachers. But I think it's because they're bored in school, right? So I think that we have a conversation, a national conversation around how do we attract a pipeline earlier? What are we doing in middle schools and high schools to attract young people to teacher apprenticeships or teacher opportunities, talking up the profession, but also really looking at our systems of teacher assignment and teacher placement to see if there are problems with those systems, and how are we really supporting people beyond the first, second, and third years of the profession who work in urban schools. Support is important, and feeling that there are incentives for them for being there is important, and sometimes those contracts in urban districts can offer some of the perks that they might get in other districts. Do you get an incentive for becoming National Board certified, right? Do you get, what kinds of steps are available to you? It matters. So I think that your question and your point is incredibly important, but I think there's lots of layers of what we need to talk about as a nation if we're going to change that.
Teresa.
I mean, I agree. I think the mentoring of new teachers by people who have been seasoned, who understand the culture of those schools is very important. I would mention something else, which is I do think this philosophy of growing your own in communities pays off as well. We've started a new program this year. The legislature passed it last year, the Next Generation Educator Scholarship, where we pick 200 high-performing students from high school. We provide them full scholarship to go to college with a commitment that they teach. Now, we know there have been a lot of programs like this, and they haven't all worked. But what we've done is we've made sure that these students actually have a relationship with teachers in the schools from which they graduate, ongoing relationships with them. And many of them, in fact, would like to go back to their communities and will have a real affinity for their communities. And this is true in rural areas in Indiana, where we are really hard-pressed to get people to go back to some of those communities, as well as the challenges we have with poor urban areas as well. And so I think the recruiting of people with the idea that they're engaged in those schools, in those communities, even as they are moving into the field of education, may in fact increase the likelihood that they will stay or go back to those areas where we've had a hard time finding teachers.
That's great. Other, yes.
You folks are doing a great job covering a wide area of things. I wanted to, my name's Jay Kahn. I'm a state senator in New Hampshire, and wanted to ask you about parenting and early starts for youngsters. We're talking about the institutionalized setting of schools, but in the homes where kids get a start or don't, where the inequity begins because of household structure, the kinds of support that are there for the kids to learn at an early age. Are you beginning to find some of the partnerships that you were talking about, communities and businesses, and seeing how they play a role? Maybe it's with other social services that do interventions to help the household prepare for bringing that child along with the kind of education and socialization that other kids get. So I'm interested in are you seeing yourselves stretched into the roles of trying to address the equity issues at those early ages?
So in Missouri, our state founded the Parents as Teachers program. I think many of you probably use that right now. And that would get to the issue that I think you're speaking to. Parents really are the first teachers, and parents want to teach their children. Of course they do, and sometimes they have the knowledge, and sometimes it's, they're just starting out. They've never had children before. And so how do we help them work together as partners to be the first teacher in their child's life? And I think what we've had to do because of budgetary restrictions is to only provide those services to our most needy families, which is our way of trying to solve some of the equity issues. But we would really like to see that available for all families, because you're right, it does start in the very first days of our children's lives, and the parents are there to usher that. We'd also like to see that program extended through the child's school career, because parents as teachers all the way through and as partners in the education system, again, couldn't be underestimated.
I would just say that in Indiana, we've seen a focus on, quality preschool options at a higher level than we'd seen in the past. And I would say in great measure it was directed by the employer community. Interestingly enough, they aren't saying we're just worried about the workforce. They're saying we have to start earlier. And they were very engaged with a coalition of employers coming to the legislature and talking about that. So I think that's really important. You've hit on what is such a difficult, hard subject, which is how do we provide a better first start for kids and get them off to a strong start, knowing that those early years you can't get back again. I mean, we don't give up on them later, but you don't get those early years back again. And I don't think there is any magic to how to do it. I think, once again, much like we talked about earlier, it requires an all-hands-on-deck kind of philosophy. I continue to believe that parents want to provide for their students in the best way possible, and that school can be overwhelming to them. There can be a real disconnect between their lives and what school is, and they're intimidated by that. To the degree that we can make them feel partners in that, and not, that we tell them what they're supposed to do, but that we bring them in a very collegial way. I think I think the days of thinking that a child gets on the school bus and goes to school and it's over are, that's just not the way we think of schools anymore. We need to be very hands-on, and we can't do this without parental involvement. And we can't do this without people in the community who are absolutely reliant on the success of these kids being involved as well. So the question earlier about communities, employers, parents, it's got to be all, and I don't have an easy solution. You probably, working in where you are, have a better solution than I would. I would just say we cannot get weary in well-doing.
Yeah. Stephanie, you have come at this most recently from the angle of high school, and it does get to that thing. So if you're in high school and you've had those gaps, How do you think about the role of parents and home once you're in high school, particularly if you're behind?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the conversations we should be having as well. I think a couple of things. First of all, high schools in low-income communities or high schools that may have students who are also parents have had to think about some of these issues as well in terms of what kinds of supports and programs can they embed in the school environment for young people who may be parents early, as well as how do we engage parents when kids are at the secondary level. And it's difficult. And I think a couple of things we can do here. One is it's re-engaging the young people. When high school students are excited and they go home and they're excited, the parents get excited, right? And that it doesn't matter how old the kid is. If they're excited about something, the parents are like, wow, it looks like you had a good day today, you know? You've got an event coming up. You got an A on a paper. This is amazing, right? So I think to the extent that we want to have parent involvement even as kids get older, it's thinking about what is the current opportunities in our high schools. Is it equitable across all of our incomes and our zip codes within our districts and states? And if not, what do we do to address that? The final thing I would say is that with parent engagement in high schools, it's engagement around something that every parent wants for their kid. Every parent wants their kid to be successful after high school. Success may be a different course for some kids who may go on to the military, may go on to 2-year or 4-year colleges, or may go straight into the workforce, or may take a gap year, right? But every parent wants their kid to be successful after high school. How are we beginning to help young people identify what success, what their future may be, and helping that young person engage their parents in that vision setting is how we keep parents engaged at the high school level.
Yeah, I'd just add one of the valuable learnings I've had in looking at the global programs that we oversee, that we've made big investments in nutrition, and the global nutrition community has a lens of the first 1,000 days, conception to age 2. I know we talk about 1,000 days up to the age of 3, but if you think of that as magic, that mom is well-fed, vaccinated, has safe childbirth, knows about exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, a child has access to clean water, sanitation, and healthy mom and vaccinations. I think there's some things for us to learn about early start, early education and beyond, that gets to mom and family and home, not to leave out dads, but that first 1,000 days, the return on investment is really profound. And that is portable from the global world to our experience. So we're going to run out of time. So I want to, in the spirit of the world I live in of impatient optimism, let's end with some optimism. I want each of our panelists to tell the audience what gives you the most hope about the work that you're doing, and why should this audience leave this panel discussion with hope today? I'll start with you, Margie.
Okay, great. What gives me hope? I think that this is the conversation, that ECS selected this topic as a primary topic to host today. It is the conversation. What gives me hope is that I do have the opportunity to work with the chiefs across the nation. This is the conversation, and we're very fortunate to have many chiefs across this nation who are leading for equity, and that gives me great hope. At the local level, very inspired by the shift in thinking of our school leaders, where they used to talk more about my kids and my district and ensuring that they get the diploma. The conversation has now shifted to our children, and are they going to be successful when they leave us? So it's a big mind shift, and you know, as I said, with 518 districts, we share kids all the time. And we want to make sure that every child is given that great opportunity because they are our children.
I actually agree. I think the siloed conversations that we used to have, I think we now have very integrated conversations. You know, as I said earlier, this convergence between educators and policymakers and employers actually having these conversations, I think is very encouraging, because at the end of the day, we are all invested in making sure that these students have the opportunity to live meaningful lives, knowing that they will benefit and we will benefit from that. So a discussion like today, even though we don't even know how to have it sometimes. I mean, even talking, if you ask everybody in the room what equity means, our perspectives might be very different. But that's all the more reason for us to have the conversation, and thank you to ECS for making sure that we did.
I'll echo the thanks. I think it's great that we're having the conversation today. A couple things that give me hope. The first is that there's opportunity. With the changes in how the Every Student Succeeds Act came about, there is opportunity for people to have state and local conversations about what's important to you and how you're going to get to that vision of equity for all young people. It can be scary, particularly because it's hard to know how to help every student population be successful, but that's why the inclusion, the stakeholder conversations that you've been having is very important. We can't determine equity from this room. We only can work together with others to set a common vision for equity and work together to get there. I also am encouraged by the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations are happening across the nation. The nonprofit world, the philanthropic world, and even in the states and districts and your seats, we're all talking about equity right now, and there's incredible data and information out there, and I hope that we'll continue learning with and from each other, because there are some models, there are some approaches, and together we can do more to help young people be successful.
One of my bosses, Melinda Gates, talks about our U.S. programs in higher education and K through 20 as the hardest work we do. And I actually think it is the hardest work we do. What gives me hope is no matter if you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, or human capital and economic opportunity, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, this matters to you. So having this community-driven passion for student success gives me a lot of hope. So please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. Thank you all.